Before the first spear is raised, before the first shout of "This is Sparta" echoes through a packed theater, something magical has already happened. A story has been sold. It looks like history, feels like legend, smells like victory. But what if the price of that thrill was truth? 300 isn't just a film. It's an emotional uppercut wrapped in blood-red cloaks and ripped abs. When it hit theaters in 2006, it did something extraordinary. It made thousands of years of history feel like a music video directed by a war god, hyper-stylized, savage, beautiful. Zack Snyder's cinematic vision, combined with Frank Miller's gritty graphic novel, gave us a Sparta that bleeds myth, not facts, and that's where the problem begins. Because the story of 300 Spartans standing alone against a tidal wave of Persian invaders is seductive. Too seductive. It has all the ingredients of hero worship: sacrifice, freedom, honor, defiance. But it's also wrong, or at least not the whole story. The truth is more complex, less glamorous, and far more human. What if I told you there weren't just 300? What if I told you they wore armor, not pride? What if I told you this wasn't just a battle, but the birth of a legend carved from half-truths? Let's walk through the smoke and slow-motion blood splatter and step into the messy, unfiltered world of the real Battle of Thermopylae. The movie makes it simple. 300 men, one narrow pass, a sea of enemies. Reality doesn't care for simplicity. History records that when King Leonidas marched north from Sparta, he wasn't leading a suicidal death squad. He was heading up an elite vanguard, part of a larger coalition of Greek forces trying to delay the Persian tide. There were over 7,000 men at Thermopylae. That's not Hollywood drama. That's coalition politics. The Spartans brought their 300 warriors. Yes, that part is true. But each of them was accompanied by 3 Helots, state-owned slaves who served as squires, cooks, shield-bearers, and sometimes unwilling fighters. That adds nearly 900 more to the ranks. They were joined by 700 Thespians, 1,000 Phocians, 400 Thebans, and a smattering of Peloponnesian allies. Together, they formed a wall. Not of steel, not of muscle, but of unity. The idea that the Spartans stood alone makes for great film, but it does a disservice to the thousands of others who chose to stand and die alongside them. And when the battle turned, when betrayal opened a secret mountain path behind the Greek lines, Leonidas didn't get abandoned. He gave an order. He told the majority to retreat and live to fight another day, but around 2,000 men refused to leave. Spartans, Thespians, Helots, even some Thebans, they stayed to buy time with their lives. They weren't just extras in a Spartan movie. They were warriors in their own right. They deserved to be remembered. In Zack Snyder's 300, the Spartans charge into battle nearly naked, their chiseled torsos glistening with sweat and rage. They wear red cloaks, leather briefs, and an air of immortality. It's cinematic candy. But historically, it's closer to fantasy cosplay than military reality. Real Spartan warriors did not go into battle half-dressed. They were not shirtless gladiators on a protein shake diet. They were professionals, among the most disciplined and heavily armed soldiers of their era. Their battlefield outfit wasn't designed for drama. It was designed to keep them alive. Let's break the illusion. Spartans wore bronze chest plates, sculpted to match the human body, yes, but made of metal, not abs. They donned Corinthian helmets, tight-fitting and crested, shielding nearly the entire face. Lamellar armor, made from layered leather or bronze scales, was common among those who could afford it. These layers could stop arrows and absorb slashes. Bronze greaves protected their shins. Wool chitons, knee-length tunics, were standard beneath the armor. And most sacred of all, the aspis, a massive round shield nearly 1 meter in diameter. Made of wood, covered in leather, and rimmed in bronze, it was heavy, crucial, and symbolic. You didn't just carry a shield in Sparta, you carried your honor. To lose it was worse than death. In battle, Spartans didn't charge recklessly like action movie heroes. They moved as one, they breathed as one, they struck as one. This was the phalanx, a tight wall of shields and spears, a living, breathing machine of war. Each man's shield didn't just protect himself, it protected the man to his left. It was a formation built on trust and interdependence. If one man broke rank, the line fell. Spears, and sometimes over 4 meters long, were used underhand from afar and overhead in close quarters. It wasn't flashy, but it was lethal. In 300, warriors break formation constantly for dramatic solo fights. That might make a theater audience cheer, but to a Spartan general, it would have been suicidal. Spartan warfare wasn't about individual heroism. It was about collective strength, discipline, endurance, silence in the ranks, and fury in the strike. So why did the film strip the Spartans of their armor? Frank Miller, the comic's creator, openly admitted it. They looked cooler without it. From a visual standpoint, sure. You want your heroes to be recognizable, identifiable, sexy even. So in the film, King Leonidas alone wears a crested helmet so viewers always know who he is. The rest, well, they look like a Calvin Klein ad with spears. But in real war, looking cool came second to not dying. The idea of running into battle bare-chested, exposed to arrows, swords, and javelins, that wasn't bravery, it was madness. The true bravery of the Spartans lay not in their muscles but in their method, not in their swagger but in their sacrifice. They weren't rebels screaming at the sky. They were soldiers, and the phalanx was their church. Every footstep mattered, every shield grip counted, and every warrior knew. You fight for the man beside you, not for glory, not for show, but because his life depends on you. That's the kind of discipline you don't capture. In slow motion, when Xerxes first appears in 300, he glides onto the screen like a god descending from a dream, towering, golden, pierced, soft-spoken, yet threatening. He is part emperor, part deity, part nightmare. He is also, almost entirely, fiction. The movie, Xerxes is depicted as a narcissistic giant, a man of exaggerated luxury and absolute confidence, leading an endless horde with zero subtlety or strategy. He wants Greece not for its resources or position, but seemingly just to own it, to break it because he can. But the historical Xerxes? He was nothing like that. According to ancient sources, including Herodotus, Xerxes was a man of average height, a neatly bearded ruler with a strong sense of heritage and an eye for empire. He was cautious, not careless, calculated, not theatrical. Xerxes didn't rule through intimidation alone. He governed one of the largest empires in the ancient world, the Achaemenid Persian Empire, with a mix of military strength, religious tolerance, and administrative brilliance. He funded roads, he protected trade routes, he supported temples, architecture, and education across multiple cultures. He didn't just invade, he built. So why does the movie depict him as a pierced warlord surrounded by monsters? Because a towering god-king makes for a better villain. In the West, we're used to stories of white and black morality, heroes and villains, good and evil. The idea of the Persian king being human, with fears, hopes, and logic, complicates the narrative. It forces us to see the enemy as more than a shadow, and Hollywood hates moral ambiguity. Let's be clear, Xerxes did invade Greece. He did want to expand his empire. He did bring a massive army, but he wasn't doing it because of pride, alone. He was finishing what his father, Darius I, started, a war launched in retaliation for Greek interference in Persian-controlled Ionia. In his world, this wasn't madness, it was duty. Ironically, while the film elevates Leonidas to mythical perfection, it dehumanizes Xerxes to the point of absurdity. Xerxes never met Leonidas face to face. He didn't ride elephants or wear chains across his chest. He didn't command beasts from atop a gold throne in the dirt. And most importantly, he didn't rule alone. Persian generals, engineers, and satraps formed a vast command structure. Strategy wasn't based on divine arrogance, and it was based on logistics, terrain, and timing. Even the animals used in the movie, the enormous rhinoceros, the war elephants crashing through Greek lines and are products of visual flair, not evidence. There's no record of such beasts being used at Thermopylae. The real Persian shock troops were horsemen. Skilled cavalry made up about 20% of the invading force, and they were deadly. But here's the twist that makes this all so tragic. By turning Xerxes into a caricature, 300 robs us of something valuable, the chance to see two worldviews collide. Not just muscle versus mass, but freedom versus order, local pride versus imperial reach, a fading warrior class versus a rising bureaucratic empire. Those are real stakes, and far more interesting than a cartoonish god-king. So the next time someone mentions how awesome 300 was, remind them of this. The true war wasn't between heroes and monsters. It was between men, flawed, brilliant, terrified, determined. And Xerxes, the man history tried to flatten into a villain, was actually one of the most complex leaders of the ancient world. Not a beast, not a brute, but a builder. The screen trembles. A monstrous rhinoceros, armored and snarling, charges into the Spartan line. Giant warriors with bone piercings swing axes the size of doors. Creatures pulled from nightmares fill the battlefield, framing the Spartans not just as warriors, but as underdogs standing against the impossible. It's thrilling. It's epic. It's complete nonsense. In 300, the battlefield feels like something out of a dark fantasy, more Tolkien than Thucydides. It's easy to get swept up in the madness, but those mythological beasts, they never stepped foot in Thermopylae. There were no rhinoceroses, no ogre-sized warriors, no executioners with blades like guillotines, and certainly no magical immortals, in silver masks wielding swords like gymnasts. The real Persian army was terrifying, but in its discipline, not its monsters. It was a machine built for siege and conquest, not theater. It relied on cavalry, archers, and elite infantry, not circus creatures. If anything, it was a force of brutal normality, not fantasy. But let's talk about the one fantasy creature that actually spoke in the film. Dilios, the one-eyed Spartan storyteller. He's played with gritty charisma, delivering the movie's final monologue with fire. He's our narrator, our anchor, our emotional guide. And like much of the film, he's entirely made up. In the actual history, there was no Dilios. But Herodotus, the ancient historian who chronicled the Persian Wars, does mention two real Spartans who survived Thermopylae, Aristodemus and Eurytus. Both were stricken with serious eye infections before the final stand. King Leonidas, rather than risk weakening the line, ordered them home. Eurytus refused. He had his Helot servant lead him blind back into battle, where he died. Aristodemus obeyed, and was branded a coward by Spartan society. That stigma followed him for a year, until he fought at the Battle of Plataea with such suicidal bravery that it horrified even his own comrades. He died in that fight, and yet he still wasn't honored, because Spartans didn't celebrate reckless death, only courageous survival with purpose. Dilios, as a character, was born from this tangle of legend and shame. He's an echo of Aristodemus, but rewritten into a noble orator, someone who turns pain into purpose, loss into legend. He's the Hollywood version of a broken man, polished and inspirational. It makes for a great story, but the real story, it hurts more, because it's messy and human and far too real. This distortion doesn't end with one man. In 300, the Spartans fight like superhumans. Every strike is a ballet, every death, a slow-motion poem. But war wasn't poetic. It was panic. It was mud. It was blood and screaming, and confusion. The Greeks at Thermopylae were trapped, betrayed, and terrified, yet they stood, not for cinematic glory, but for strategy, for time, for their homes. That's the twist that hits hardest. The truth is more inspiring than the myth, because it wasn't 300 superheroes that held the line. It was thousands of farmers, potters, smiths, regular men in bronze, led by a 60-year-old king buying time with their lives. There's no rhino that can top that. No mutant warrior more heroic than a father who chose to die so his children could live free. If 300 is to be believed, Sparta was a land of honor, discipline, and unshakable brotherhood. A warrior utopia forged in blood and bronze. But history tells a colder story, one that smells less like glory and more like iron and ash. Behind, the red cloaks beneath the bronze helmets, Sparta was a brutal state propped up by mass slavery. Its warriors trained for war, and because they didn't need to farm, they didn't need to build, they didn't even need to cook. Helots did all of that, and more. Helots weren't just slaves. They were a subjugated class, stripped of autonomy, but forced to live among their masters. Unlike traditional chattel slaves, they weren't bought and sold. They were conquered peoples, often the descendants of those who dared resist Spartan expansion centuries earlier. They made up the majority of the population. Let that sink in. For every Spartan warrior you see marching into battle, there were 6 to 10 Helots laboring in the fields, preparing rations, or dragged into war as servants and expendables. They weren't respected. They weren't trained. They weren't free. And in some ways, their fate was worse than death. Spartan boys were taught from age 7 to dominate, not just enemies on the battlefield, but Helots at home. This wasn't a bug in the system. It was the system, and the cruelty was not occasional. It was ritualized. Each year during a religious observance known as the Cryptia, Spartan youths were ordered to declare war on the Helots. Not metaphorically, literally. Young Spartans would be sent out in small bands, hiding by day, hunting by night. Their task? To kill Helots. Silently, swiftly, without warning. It was seen as a rite of passage, a test of stealth, a demonstration of dominance. This wasn't a response to rebellion. It was preventative terror. Sparta ruled through fear, not inspiration. Helots were forbidden from learning combat, forbidden from speaking freely, forbidden from dressing like citizens. They were required to perform humiliating tasks, to serve at banquets where they were mocked, forced to drink themselves into shame for Spartan amusement, living, breathing reminders of what it meant to be conquered. In 425 BCE, Sparta made a promise. They told 2,000 Helots, the strongest, the most loyal, that if they stepped forward and proved themselves, they would be granted freedom. The Helots came, hoping for a new life. Instead, they were slaughtered in secret, disappeared. It was state-sanctioned betrayal, a cleansing. Because a strong slave is a dangerous slave. These are the truths that 300 omits, or worse, rewrites. In the film, the Helots are barely seen. When they do appear, they're shadows, footnotes, sometimes mocked, other times ignored, but never remembered. What's worse? The movie asks us to cheer for the same system that brutalized them. It paints Spartan warriors as noble defenders of freedom, while hiding the fact that their freedom was built on the backs of those they enslaved and murdered. That's not heroism, that's hegemony. And when we erase the Helots, we erase the cost of Spartan greatness. This isn't to say Spartans weren't brave. They were. But courage in war does not excuse cruelty at home, and honoring the real Spartans means telling the whole story, not just the parts that look good in slow motion. Their empire was a paradox, a society of supreme warriors afraid of their own slaves, a people who demanded discipline from birth and ruled through suppression until death, a land where boys were forged into soldiers, and compassion was burned away in fire and blood. The truth isn't comfortable, but history rarely is, and if we want to understand Sparta, not just worship it, we must be willing to stare into the shadows behind the shield. It's one of the most chilling scenes in 300. A stern elder examines a newborn, eyes cold and calculating. The infant is lifted, judged, and if found wanting, cast off a cliff into a pit of skulls. It's brutal, it's unforgettable. It's also probably a myth. For centuries, people have whispered about Sparta's eugenics, about how only the strong were allowed to live and the weak were discarded like broken pottery. The image is powerful. It reinforces the idea that Sparta was merciless, hard, a machine that valued perfection over humanity. But where did this story come from? One man, Plutarch. Writing over 500 years after the Battle of Thermopylae, Plutarch claimed that Spartan elders inspected every newborn. If a child was deemed frail, sickly, or malformed, it was taken to a place called Mount Taygetus and left to die. That's it. One source, written centuries after the events. No corroboration, no archaeological proof. And that's where modern science stepped in. Enter Theodoros Pitzios, an anthropologist from the University of Athens. He examined bones recovered from the base of the infamous chasm on Mount Taygetus, the supposed death pit of unwanted Spartan babies. The results? The remains belonged to teenagers and adult males aged roughly 18 to 35, not infants. These individuals were likely criminals or traitors, executed and discarded, not newborns sacrificed at birth. There is no physical evidence that Spartans systematically killed their infants. No mass graves of babies. No consistent records from other contemporary sources. No confirmed burial rituals for discarded newborns. So why does the myth persist? Because it's effective. It fits the narrative. It makes Sparta seem both terrifying and awe-inspiring. A society so committed to strength that it snuffs out weakness before it can cry. But real life and real Spartans were more complicated. Let's pause for a moment and consider the emotional cost of this myth. What happens when a society believes in, or even pretends to believe in, such extreme standards? What happens when we glorify the idea that only the strong deserve life? We risk creating admiration for cruelty, we turn discipline into dogma, and we ignore the quiet, ordinary truth. Most Spartan babies were raised by mothers, loved, fed, and named. Even in Sparta, human instinct prevailed. Plutarch's story may have been metaphorical, an exaggerated example of Spartan values, a warning, a dramatization, or maybe it was just good storytelling. Either way, turning it into a cinematic spectacle, complete with a pit of skulls and dramatic music, cemented it in public imagination. Hollywood didn't create the myth, but it gave it muscle. Here's what likely did happen. Yes, Spartan babies were examined at birth, as were children in many ancient societies. Midwives or elders checked for signs of serious defects or illness. That part is plausible. If a child was born too weak to survive, they might have been left to die by exposure, a cruel practice sadly common across many ancient cultures, not just Sparta. But the idea of a formalized execution pit, of a government-sanctioned infant death sentence, that is story over substance. It's easy to forget that even in brutal societies, people are still people. Mothers still wept, fathers still hoped, and no culture, however rigid, is entirely devoid of compassion. The real tragedy isn't whether this practice happened or not. It's that we accepted it without question, because it fit the myth so well, because it made the Spartans seem superhuman. And superhuman stories are easier to admire than to understand. You know the scene. A cloaked Persian envoy stands calmly before King Leonidas, demanding earth and water, the traditional symbols of submission to the Persian Empire. Leonidas glares. There's a pause, and then the kick. With a thunderous roar, the Spartan king bellows, "This is Sparta," and sends the envoy flying down a well, face first into cinematic immortality. Audiences erupted. Memes were born. Pop culture was changed forever. But history? History raised an eyebrow, because that entire scene, while iconic, never happened. Let's start with the supposed demand, earth and water. That part is actually true. In ancient Persian diplomacy, requesting earth and water symbolized the submission of one land to another, a ceremonial recognition that one empire had sovereignty over the other. Xerxes did send envoys with that demand to Greek city-states, and Sparta's reaction? It was dramatic, but not that dramatic. According to Herodotus, The Spartans did kill Persian envoys, not with kicks or screaming, but by throwing them down a well or into a pit. No booming voice, no slow-mo, just death. But here's the twist. That execution of envoys happened years earlier, before the Persian army ever reached Thermopylae. It was not part of Leonidas's campaign, nor was it a public spectacle in front of a crowd. It was an act of defiance, yes, but not a movie scene. And it came at a cost. Killing messengers was a major breach of diplomatic custom, even in ancient times. After the incident, Xerxes never sent another envoy to Sparta. He saw no point. But here's the irony. While Sparta punished Persian envoys harshly, other Greek city-states chose diplomacy, choosing neutrality, or offering tokens of submission, to buy time or avoid destruction. Sparta's violence wasn't just bold, it was isolating. And in some ways it pushed Greece closer to war than negotiation ever did. So why did 300 make such a big deal out of that one kick? Because that moment encapsulates everything the movie wants you to feel. Pride, rage, defiance, the raw, primal thrill of standing up to a vast empire with nothing but muscle and fury. It's a theatrical gut punch. And it works. Too well. Because now, millions associate Leonidas with that line, and not with his real military strategy, his political struggles, or the quiet desperation of holding a suicidal position at the edge of a mountain pass. The kick overshadows the man. It also hides something more profound. In reality, Leonidas wasn't brash. He wasn't reckless. He was a calculated leader navigating impossible politics. When the Persians approached, Sparta was in the middle of a religious festival, the Carneia, during which no warfare was permitted. Leonidas knew that sending a full army would violate sacred custom, so he led a small vanguard, not as a rebellious rogue, but as a man buying time, honoring both Spartan law and Greek survival. His mission wasn't to win, it was to delay. To die if needed so others could prepare. There's no kick dramatic enough to capture that kind of quiet courage, and yet the myth lives on. The well, the boot, the growl. It became a rallying cry, for strength, for rebellion, for viral memes. But it also became a mask, one that hides the truth of what made Leonidas truly heroic. Not his rage, his restraint. The cliffs of Thermopylae, the mountain winds, the narrow pass. That's the image the film gives us, and it's unforgettable. But it's only half the story. Because while Leonidas and his warriors faced the Persian army head-on at Thermopylae, another battle was raging just offshore, one that 300 doesn't mention, not even once. It was called the Battle of Artemisium, and it may have been the real key to Greek survival. Let's rewind. When Xerxes set his sights on Greece, his strategy wasn't reckless, it was comprehensive. A land invasion supported by a massive naval force, one of the largest the ancient world had ever seen. The goal? Squeeze Greece from two sides. To stop him, the Greek alliance couldn't rely on Spartans alone. They needed a plan. And so at a council of city-states, including Athens, Sparta, Corinth, and others, the Greek generals agreed. They would block the Persian army at Thermopylae, and simultaneously block the Persian fleet at Artemisium, a narrow strait off the coast of Euboea. A two-pronged resistance. Leonidas would delay Xerxes on land, and the Greek navy would hold the line at sea. The naval force was commanded by Themistocles, an Athenian general and political mastermind. And it wasn't a small skirmish. It was a brutal, chaotic 3-day clash of ships, fire, and fury. Imagine it. Hundreds of warships ramming each other in tight straits, triremes, long, narrow, vessels powered by rows of oarsmen, slamming hulls with bronze rams, boarding parties clashing on slippery decks, waves churning with broken planks and broken bodies, and yet somehow the vastly outnumbered Greeks held the line. They fought with cunning, using the narrow waters to neutralize Persia's numbers. They delayed the fleet, disrupted the invasion, and bought Leonidas crucial time. It was Artemisium that prevented the Persians from surrounding the Greek army at Thermopylae from the sea. Without it, the Spartan stand would have been meaningless. The irony? 100 shows a storm destroying part of the Persian navy, which did happen, but never mentions the coordinated naval defense that made Leonidas's sacrifice matter. Themistocles' ships fought for 3 days. The same 3 days Leonidas held the pass. They withdrew only after hearing of the defeat at Thermopylae, not because they lost, but because they were no longer protecting anything. They had done their job. Why did Hollywood leave it out? Because it's complicated, because it introduces new characters, naval tactics, political councils, strategy over savagery. It shifts the focus away from the raw simplicity of 300 men versus 1,000,000. But the truth is, Greece was saved by cooperation, not individual glory. Thermopylae was a delaying tactic. Artemisium was a strategic defense. Together, they set the stage for the eventual Greek victory at Salamis, where the Persian navy was decisively crushed, and the tide of the war began to turn. So when we remember Thermopylae, we must also remember the sailors, the Athenian oarsmen with blistered hands, the Corinthian archers on swaying decks, the generals who argued, compromised, and acted with purpose. Leonidas held the ground. But Themistocles bought the time. The movie 300 asks us to believe that victory was earned through sheer will and muscle, but history tells us a more meaningful truth. Victory came from unity, from strategy, from sacrifice shared across land and sea. And in forgetting Artemisium, we risk forgetting the full price that was paid, and the full brilliance of those who paid it. In 300, King Leonidas is portrayed as a lone wolf, a rogue warrior king who defies corrupt priests and bureaucrats to do what's right. He ignores tradition, he ignores law. He marches to war because he must. It's a powerful image. It's yam. Also, surprise, not what happened. Let's start with something most viewers never even hear. Sparta had 2 kings. That's right. Sparta was ruled by a dual monarchy, one king from the Agiad dynasty, one from the Eurypontid. It was a power-sharing system as old as the city itself. One king handled foreign military campaigns, the other stayed home, managing religion and civil affairs. Leonidas was only one half of Sparta's leadership. His decisions were not made in a vacuum. He answered to a complex system of elected officials, noble families, and, perhaps most famously, the ephors. In the film, the ephors are portrayed as grotesque, decaying mystics, corrupted by bribes, enslaved by fear, more fungus than, but in truth the ephors were the executive council of Sparta. Elected annually, these 5 magistrates oversaw the king, enforced laws, and ensured balance within Spartan society. Yes, they held the power to veto a king's decision. And yes, they were deeply religious, which brings us to the Carnea. The Carnea was one of Sparta's most sacred festivals, a religious observance dedicated to Apollo, and during this festival, no war could be declared, no campaigns launched, no armies sent out. It wasn't just tradition, it was law. Leonidas couldn't take the full Spartan army, even if he wanted to, not unless he was willing to break religious law, an act that could tear the city in 2. So what did he do? He followed the law and found a loophole. Leonidas chose 300 warriors, not just any 300. These were his personal bodyguards, men bound to him by loyalty and custom. He led them north, not as a full invasion, but as a preemptive escort mission, a vanguard to defend the pass until the festival ended and the main force could join. It was not defiance. It was a sacrifice within the rules, a compromise between duty to the gods, duty to the state, and duty to the Greek world. Leonidas wasn't rebelling. He was balancing sacred law and military necessity, walking a political tightrope under the shadow of Persian invasion. And the gamble? It worked, because that delay, those 3 days of fire and blood, bought time for the Greek alliance to gather, to rally, to prepare. It turned Thermopylae from a massacre into a message. Greece will resist, even when divided, even when outnumbered, even when doomed. But there's one more layer. Leonidas's last stand wasn't a random choice. It was a calculated message, to allies, enemies, and history itself. He knew the pass would fall. He knew he would die. And he knew the world was watching. In holding the pass and dying with his men, he created a myth powerful enough to unify fractured cities, Athens and Sparta, rivals for centuries, now partners in war. That unity would culminate a year later in the Battle of Salamis, where Greek ships, led by Themistocles, crushed the Persian navy and turned the tide of the entire war. So when we look back at Leonidas, let's set aside the slow-motion kicks and shirtless bravado. Let's remember him as he truly was, a 60-year-old king caught between politics, faith, and fear, leading not 300 heroes but 1,000 men with names, families, and doubts, dying not for glory, but to hold the line long enough for others to live. That's the true power of Thermopylae, not in what was won, but in what was made possible.